Deep within the National Archives, hidden behind layers of bureaucratic red tape and steel vault doors, there exists a folder so heavily redacted that more black ink remains on the page than legible text. It is a document dated 1943, carrying a warning that remains chilling decades later. Some secrets are buried not to protect the state, but to protect the sanity of those who might uncover them. In the autumn of that year, the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard was a place of frantic, shadowed industry. The air was thick with the stinging scent of salt spray and the metallic tang of welding torches. Rain slicked the gray concrete of the docks, reflecting the dim, flickering lights of a world at war. Docked among the giants of the fleet sat the USS Eldridge, a cannon-class destroyer escort that appeared, to any casual observer, entirely unremarkable. Yet, deep within its steel hull, a terrifying secret was being wired into its very bones. The military high command was desperate. In the depths of World War II, the race for technological supremacy was a matter of survival, and the United States was seeking a technological ghost. They wanted a vessel that could slip through the Atlantic unseen, a phantom ship that neither the human eye nor enemy detection could track. This was Project Rainbow, a shadowy initiative born from the darkest corners of scientific ambition. Rumors whispered through the corridors of power that the project was built upon the unreleased theories of Albert Einstein himself. The unified field theory, a pursuit to link the forces of electromagnetism and gravity, was no longer a theoretical exercise. It had become a weapon. Shadowy figures, men whose names have been scrubbed from official manifests, moved through the Eldridge like ghosts, installing massive, humming generators and miles of thick copper cabling. They were attempting to bend the very fabric of space-time, treating the laws of physics as mere suggestions in the face of military necessity. But as the experiment approached, the ship itself seemed to protest. Sailors reported strange, inexplicable phenomena. Clocks would suddenly stop or spin wildly in reverse. Men spoke of a crushing sense of impending doom that settled over them, a weight on the chest that made every breath a struggle. A low, persistent humming began to emanate from the hull, a sound so deep it was felt in the marrow of the bones. The animals on the dock refused to go near the ship, and the air around the Eldridge seemed to shimmer with an unnatural heat, even in the biting cold of a Philadelphia October. On the morning of the test, the atmosphere was electric with a tension that felt physically dangerous. As the technicians threw the final switches, the massive coils began to groan. The low hum escalated into a deafening metallic shriek that echoed across the shipyard. A strange, sickly greenish mist began to crawl over the deck, emerging from nowhere and clinging to the steel like a living thing. It was a luminous haze that seemed to swallow the light around it, turning the day into a murky underwater twilight. The generators reached 100% capacity, and the entire ship began to vibrate with such intensity that the water surrounding the hull started to boil. The crew's initial confusion turned instantly into pure, unadulterated terror. Screams began to erupt from the deck, not simple cries of fear, but sounds of agonizing torment that suggested the very atoms of their bodies were being pulled apart. The USS Eldridge started to flicker, its solid steel frame turning translucent, then shimmering like a heat mirage in a desert. As the vibration reached a crescendo that threatened to shatter reality itself, the ship began to vibrate out of existence. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The witnesses on the shore saw a flash of blinding blue light consume the vessel. In a heartbeat, where 1,000 tons of steel had stood, there was only empty, churning water and the echoes of men who had ceased to be. The flash of blue light was a physical punch that knocked observers back, searing their retinas. When the spots finally cleared from their eyes, the USS Eldridge was gone. No splash or debris remained in its wake. A perfect circular depression stayed in the water, as if an invisible weight pressed down on the river's surface. The water bubbled at the edges of the void, reacting to the sudden displacement of matter. The air smelled of ionized oxygen and burnt hair, a localized thunderstorm that refused to dissipate even as the shock settled over the shipyard. Inside the hull, the laws of the universe ceased to function. To the men on board, the world turned gray, a flat, featureless void where the concepts of up and down were discarded. The very atoms of the ship seemed to vibrate at a frequency that the human soul was never meant to endure. Sailors trying to scream found their voices muffled by an atmosphere thick like warm oil. Carlos Allende watched in horror as his own hands turned translucent. He saw pulsating veins, then bone, then the churning water beneath the deck. The ship was no longer solid. It was a flickering memory held together by the electromagnetic field. They were suspended in non-being, caught between reality and a dimension without a name. While Philadelphia stared at an empty berth 400 miles south, guards at Norfolk Naval Base witnessed a miracle. Out of thin air, a destroyer escort materialized. The Norfolk Guard stood frozen, unable to look away from the spectral sight of a ship that shouldn't exist. Shrouded in green mist, its form shimmered like a heat mirage. For several minutes, the men watched the ghostly vessel bob in the waves, its deck populated by silhouettes carved from fog. Then, with a crack like a thunderclap, it vanished, leaving only steaming water and traumatized witnesses who were later told they had seen nothing but a trick of light. Back at the shipyard, the situation became a nightmare. The massive generators glowed with a white-hot intensity that threatened the dock. The high command watched from a distance, their faces pale as they realized the monster they had unleashed. Scientists scrambled to shut down the power, but switches had fused shut. Equipment was melting into the floor, becoming one with the concrete. The green fog had become a corrosive vapor that burned skin. Men felt their flesh blister as if exposed to radiation, their screams lost in the shriek of the collapsing magnetic field. Communication was impossible. Radios emitted only a static that sounded like human weeping. As energy levels fluctuated, the freeze emerged. Sailors suddenly stopped mid-stride, stuck in a single moment of time. The frozen men were like anchors in a sea of madness, silent witnesses to a crime against nature. To their terrified comrades, they looked like statues of salt, eyes wide and staring. These men were caught in ripples of the field. One sailor reached to touch a frozen friend, only to have his hand pass through the man's shoulder as if it were made of water. The psychological toll was worse. In the gray void, survivors saw things that defied explanation. They claimed the air's ripples were windows. Through these tears, they saw entities, vast, unblinking shapes moving through shadows. The men felt watched by something that had been waiting for a door to open. Many lost their minds, clawing at their eyes to stop seeing the impossible geometries that now defined their world. Then, the energy spike collapsed. The generators died with a metallic crunch. The blue light flared and the USS Eldridge slammed back into the Philadelphia harbor. Water exploded in a massive plume. As the waves settled and the mist lifted, a heavy silence fell. No orders were shouted. No sailors scrambled to the railings. There was only the sound of cooling metal and the distant lapping of the tide against a hull that had seen the end of reality. The shipyard was frozen in a moment of communal shock as the first boarding parties prepared to step directly into the unknown. The silence aboard the USS Eldridge was not the quiet of a sleeping vessel, but the suffocating hush of a tomb. When the first military officials climbed the gangplank, the stench of ozone and scorched meat hit them like a physical blow. As they moved through the lingering green haze, the true cost of Project Rainbow was revealed in a tableau of cosmic horror. Men were not merely dead. They were integrated into the fabric of the ship. In the midship area, sailors had become one with the steel deck, their legs and torsos protruding from the metal, as if they had been poured into a mold while the ship was still liquid. One man's hand gripped a railing, but the flesh of his fingers was indistinguishable from the iron. Their faces were contorted in a final, frozen scream of agony, eyes wide with the realization their atoms had been rearranged by a force humanity was never meant to harness. The survivors who remained unfused were perhaps even more cursed. Those found huddled in corners were no longer the sailors who had departed. They were shells of men, their minds shattered by the sights they had witnessed in the gray void. In the weeks that followed, the horror refused to end. Reports leaked of survivors who had suddenly become translucent while eating dinner in the mess hall, their bodies fading like ghosts before completely vanishing into thin air. Others succumbed to spontaneous combustion, bursting into inexplicable flames that left nothing but ash. The military high command acted with ruthless efficiency to contain the scandal. Every logbook from the Eldridge was seized and rewritten, removing any mention of the test. The crew members were discharged under labels of mental instability, their stories dismissed as the hallucinations of broken men. Years later, fragments of the truth began to resurface through the persistent efforts of researcher Morris Jessup. He received a series of cryptic letters from a man calling himself Carlos Allende, claiming to have witnessed the entire event from a nearby merchant marine vessel. Allende's correspondence spoke of the unified field theory and the terrifying side effects of the experiment, describing men who simply went into the freeze and never returned. Jessup's investigation into these claims began to draw the unwanted attention of the authorities. Just as he seemed to be closing in on a breakthrough that would link Einstein's theories to the tragedy in Philadelphia, he was found dead in his car. Though ruled a suicide, the circumstances were suspicious, marked by a lack of an autopsy and the disappearance of his most recent notes. Many believed it was a final act of the cover-up, a way to ensure the secrets of the Eldridge remained buried forever. The scientific implications of the disaster were far more profound than the mere bending of light or the evasion of radar. The experiment had accidentally ripped a jagged hole in the tapestry of three-dimensional space, exposing the crew to a realm where time and matter were terrifyingly fluid. The unified field theory, once an elegant mathematical dream, had become a visceral nightmare, proving that the boundary between presence and absence was thinner than anyone dared imagine. Some theorists suggested that the ship hadn't just moved through space, but had momentarily slipped into a parallel dimension, a place where the entities the sailors described were the true masters. The military did not abandon the technology, they simply moved it. Rumors persisted that the research was transferred to more secluded locations, such as the subterranean labs at Montauk, where the lessons learned from the Eldridge's failure were used to refine mind control and temporal manipulation. For the families of the lost sailors, there was no closure, only a lingering shadow of loss, and a government that denied their very existence. These men had been transformed into human experiments for a war machine that viewed them as expendable assets in a race for technological supremacy. As decades passed, the story of the Philadelphia experiment drifted into the realm of urban legend. Yet the chilling core of the narrative remains. If the military possessed the power to make a destroyer escort vanish and merge human flesh with steel in 1943, we are left to wonder what they are hiding in the vast, empty reaches of the oceans today. The secrets of the Eldridge suggest that some things are not meant to be seen, and the price of invisibility is often paid in the very substance of our reality.